Well, good morning, everyone. Yesterday, we started looking at God's sovereignty over the human heart, which we see also in Exodus chapter 7 to 11, and how God deals with Pharaoh. We ended by talking about how there is a balance that the Bible has here and gives us that God doesn't fully explain. God is absolutely sovereign over everything that happens, and yet man, like Pharaoh, is still responsible for his actions. And we're going to look at a little bit more about how this works today. But first, I want to let you know that this is going to be the last Devo for this week. I'm going to stop the Saturday Devos. You see, with Sunday night evening worship starting and Pastor Chris having to help his dad more, honestly, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed with a lot of stuff to do, and so I'm trying to figure out ways to cut back on some things. And I don't want to stop those devotionals completely. I don't think I need to do that, but I do need to cut back a little bit. So I'm going to start just doing them 5 days a week and see how much that helps. But anyways, yesterday we saw that God doesn't show us exactly how this works. He never explains in the Bible completely how it is that he can be fully sovereign and we are responsible for our actions. So it's a paradox, something he doesn't explain. Yet we also saw from the Westminster Confession of Faith that there are things we need to notice, even in this story, that help us to see kind of how the balance works. The Westminster Confession of Faith chapter on providence, which is chapter 5, and Romans chapter 1, shows us that God judges sin by withholding, withdrawing, exposing, and giving us over to our sin. By doing so, he allows the natural sin in our hearts to take over, sin that he was holding back by his common grace. We can see this in Pharaoh. But first, let me give you an illustration to maybe help you think about it. The human heart is kind of like a nuclear reactor. So in a nuclear reactor, a chain reaction of splitting uranium atoms is controlled by careful intervention by engineers. If the reaction were left to itself, the splitting of uranium atoms would increase exponentially until the reactor either melted down or exploded like a nuclear bomb. But that reaction can be held in check and maintained by control rods that engineers insert into the reactor. Now, how those control rods work is kind of complicated. We don't need to get into that here. Depending on how deeply the rods are inserted into the reaction can be maintained at a particular level. So engineers can pull them out a little bit and get a stronger, more violent reaction, or push them in a lot and get a weaker reaction. But either way, they can maintain it at a level where they get enough energy from heat to do what they want to do, and the reactor doesn't explode. Well, the human heart is kind of like a nuclear reactor. If we were left to ourselves, our sin would increase exponentially until we destroyed the world. But God, by his common grace, holds back our sin and keeps it from getting out of control, inserts control rods into the nuclear reactor of our hearts, so to speak, even in unconverted man. Common grace, like things like governmental laws, social standards, the church throughout the world, even circumstances and events themselves. Yet you see, if God wants to harden a man, all he needs to do is sovereignly remove the control rods of his common grace bit by bit, letting the sinful heart of man take over more and more. So there are examples of this in this story that we're looking at in the plagues. In the very first plague, Pharaoh's magicians were able to reproduce the sign. All the surface water had been turned to blood, even the water in jugs and in cisterns. But the Egyptians were able to dig down into the earth and find some relatively clean water. Pharaoh's magicians were able to take a small amount of that water and reproduce the sign on a very small scale. Now, whether they did it through some trick of using food dye of some kind, or they actually were able to turn it to blood by demonic power, doesn't really matter which one. It was enough for Pharaoh to think, aha! Yahweh is no more powerful than my magicians. In fact, in chapter 7, verse 22, it tells us this. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Because of this, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So you see, God removes his control rods a little. God used the circumstances and the magician's abilities to pull those control rods out a little bit more, and Pharaoh's sinful heart took over, remaining hardened or hardening itself even more. Or take the ninth plague, for example, as another one. Pharaoh is willing to let the people go, but he's not willing to let their livestock go. And of course, there's a very good reason for that. Through the seventh and eighth plague, God has just devastated the Egyptian economy, including their livestock. They need livestock. So you see, God, through his control of the natural elements and the events, created a situation where Pharaoh would be desperate and his sinful heart would not let the people go. Again, God removes the control rods a little bit more. All he has to do is remove some of the common grace of food, which he normally provides for all, and Pharaoh's heart does the rest. God is acting sovereignly in all of this, and yet Pharaoh is also acting freely, doing the exact things that his own sinful heart wants to do as God removes his grace, like taking the control rods out of a nuclear reactor. Yet in all this, we need to remember that God's sovereignty also works for mercy. God gives grace to human hearts like ours. You see, if we were left to ourselves, our sinful hearts would never choose God, never put our faith in Jesus. But God gives grace to those who don't deserve it any more than Pharaoh did. And by giving us grace, he removes our hearts that are like nuclear reactors and gives us hearts that can love him and follow him. So God's sovereignty works both ways. With it, yes, God can judge mankind as he does to Pharaoh. But without it, everyone would be judged because no one would become a Christian at all. So you guys think about that. And we'll see you more, we'll talk more about that on Monday.